Hello and welcome to this very special show with just days to go for India's tryst with destiny, because many believe this will be the most transformational budget of all times. It is time to step back and take stock of the state of the economy. And what can the budget do to fix the fault lines? Will this budget have an overhang of demonetization, or will the mega fiscal exercise be out of the shadows of the big monetary event? Joining us are two eminent guests, Bimal, Jalan, the former RBI governor, and Jahangir Aziz of JP Morgan. Thanks both of you gentlemen for being with us. Dr. Jalan, if I may begin with you, what is your expectation from the budget 2017, given the backdrop it's really been coming in? I mean, a lot of people are talking about demonetization, its impact on growth, which has obviously taken a hit, and on consumption that has been dented. So what's your big expectation from budget 2017?
No, I don't have direct expectations per se, but like all citizens, I think that we can expect that this budget would be a very good one, because our circumstances are very, very strong, in terms of growth, although it is lower than what was anticipated earlier. But if you look at the world, look at India in the global context, and the situation is very positive. If you look at, the rest of the world, except US, we are in very good shape, one of the fastest growing countries. So I'm very positive that the budget will be good. Fiscal side is strong because of spectrum, oil prices being very low. So I have no doubt that we will have a very good budget this year.
So Jahangir Aziz, come in on that here. Dr. Jalan expects a good budget, but what about you? Do you expect the overhang of demonetization to be all over budget 2017? And already there's talk about how it's going to give a big push to cashless, how it's going to perhaps look at measures to spur growth. So will overhang of demonetization tell on budget 2017?
Right. Much will depend, Surpiya, on how the government interprets the impact of demonetization. If the interpretation, as it seems to be the case at this point in time, is that it's a temporary 2-quarter, maybe 3-quarter shock to demand and to supply, then it really doesn't make much sense to use a budget to start providing support for it, simply because by the time you get around to announcing the budget measures and implementing it, the economy is going to start recovering. And in a recovering economy, when demand is going back up, you really do not want to add additional demand, because that will start putting pressures on prices and on imports, and therefore on the current account deficit. If the interpretation is just a temporary shock, then my sense is that or the optimal policy response would be to use the budget for medium-term issues. On the other hand, if the interpretation is that the demonetization has had permanent shock on demand and permanent shock on supply side by disrupting supply chains, then that's a completely different ballgame, in which case you really want to use the budget to provide that kind of long-term, medium-term support. In general, it's a really bad idea to use fiscal policy for short-term 2-quarter, 3-quarter support, because fiscal policy is a terrible tool for doing that. It's much better to use fiscal policy, or keep the focus of fiscal policy on medium-term issues and use that, and perhaps use monetary policy along with that.
I just want to be candid here, Jahangir. Are you suggesting there is no need for consumption because one doesn't know at this point in time what the impact on growth has been? Or are we actually, and let's call a spade, are we actually budgeting in the dark because no one knows what the impact is going to be? And in no one, I'm also including the country's chief statistician as well.
Look, obviously, we aren't able to capture fully what the impact of demonetization is, simply because we do not have a template against which we can benchmark it. If you look at countries in the past that have used demonetization, these are typically countries that is trying to reset the economy from very high inflation levels. And in that context, it makes sense to say, okay, I'm going to demonetize. This is an economy that was running at 7.5%, where inflation was about 4 or 5%. If you demonetize in that economy, the consequences of that, are unprecedented, because we don't have a template to figure it out. But, one can make reasonable, estimates about by using the channels of how demonetization affects to figure out that what kind of sequencing will happen in demand and supply side. In general, we do know that whether it's demonetization or anything else, we do know that if you take away a large portion of money supply suddenly, then the consequences on the economy are typically bad. And my sense is that what we are struggling with is to figure out, is this consequence going to last for a long time? Or is this consequence simply a matter of the money supply coming back, which most reasonable estimates would suggest sometime in by the first half of 2017 it should be back. So I think the debate more is on whether or not the act of demonetization actually disrupted the supply side of the economy more than the demand side of the economy. And that's where I think most of the debate is, because if it has disrupted the supply side of the economy, it's going to take much longer period of time for the economy to recover than if it's simply a demand shock driven by the lack of liquidity, which is what the interpretation by most of the market is.
All right, let's just put that issue to rest for a bit, and let's not debate whether it has disrupted and shocked the supply or the demand side of the economy, because empirical evidence does seem to suggest that demand is disrupted. I mean, auto sales are down, two-wheeler sales are down, and these sales are down both in urban and in rural areas, special impact on rural areas. Dr. Jalan, will this budget be about boosting consumption? Because every time there's a budget, the questions are, will it kickstart investment? But do you believe this budget will be exceptional because it does not just have to boost investments, but also perhaps revive consumption as well?
No, but investment boosts consumption. You see, ultimately, what happens? When you are investing, I mean, your employment is increasing also, and consumption will increase. So, investment is very important for our country. And the government has also given a lot of emphasis to investment. So I shouldn't worry on that score. But so far as the larger picture is concerned on employment or consumer growth and so on and so forth, I mean, we have to look at the world situation also, the global situation. And I have a very positive stance so far as India's future is concerned.
So what exactly can the budget do to boost demand and consumption according to you, Dr. Jalan?
No, as I told you, that if investment increases, employment increases, consumption will increase. Of that there is no doubt. I mean, so our inflation is under control, or more or less under control. So I should imagine that consumption will increase once investment increases, and that is the main priority. And I hope that will happen.
We've so far discussed consumption, investment, the context of the budget, but we take a quick breather and come back and discuss the other big thing in public discourse, and that is taxation, something that is going to impact viewers and producers like us. It's great to be back with all of you right here on the State of the Economy, and it's time to turn focus and talk about something that has been a big part in public discourse, and that has to do with taxes. Dr. Jalan, let me begin with you. Widening the tax base is, of course, something that India needs to do, with a tax to GDP ratio being very, very dismal at 1.5 to 2%. But do you believe there is an elbow room and an opportunity now to do so?
Yeah, I mean, it is for the government to decide. But yes, I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that so far as the fiscal situation is concerned, it's in good shape. And if so far as the rest of the inflation part is concerned, that's also in good shape. So it appears to me that yes, I mean, on the consumption side, on the investment side, we can expect a very positive budget. And similarly, in terms of tax reforms, there is also a scope for that. How far we can go, I mean, that is for the government to decide. It's I shouldn't comment on that part, but I'm sure that you will have a good budget this year.
Indeed, it will be a good budget, and we do hope there will be lower taxes as well. But Jahangir Aziz, all jokes set aside, direct tax rates have been a matter of much public debate. Having gone through demonetization, there is this expectation that a populist stance would be to reduce tax rates. I have two questions. Is there elbow room to do so? And will it be a prudent measure to go with it?
Again, Surpiya, I'm going to sound like a broken record, right? Let's say if you believe that, again, if you believe it's temporary, why cut rates? Why do anything? If you believe that there is a permanent need, there's a need to permanently shift the sources of demand, yes, then there is a very valid argument that not only should corporate tax rates be lowered and lowered substantially, but also income taxes should be lowered. Along with that, you should start raising spending on health and education, which are the large parts of a individual's household saving rate. The question then becomes, do we have the space to do that? Well, some of the space can be created by rejigging the spending that we do on an usual basis, taking away from other parts and moving it to healthcare and to education. On the tax front, look, we have a GST. The GST, we are unsure about the impact of GST immediately. Long term, obviously, is going to be positive. So the indirect tax rate you don't want to change. On the direct side rate, chances are, yes, you will probably get a short-term impact that the total amount of tax collected obviously will go down if you cut tax rate. But that is a price that you're willing to pay simply because it will create new sources of demand, and therefore it will be good for medium-term growth. And over the medium term, you will be able to recoup back that loss in revenue simply because the base goes up. Now again, let me reiterate that is a view which requires the government to acknowledge that whether it's demonetization or the collapse in global trade, that the world we are facing in 2017 is very, very different from the world that we used to face back in 2010-11. And in this new world order, we are not going to get external demand to save us, and therefore we need to seek out new sources of demand. That argument, I don't think the government has made so far. The government's, at least by looking at their policies, it still seems to be the case that they still believe that external demand and exports is going to rescue India at some point in time. We have waited for about 6-7 years for that rescue to come through. It hasn't. And that the demonetization impact is just temporary. If you put the two together, then there is actually no reason to do any of the tax cuts that are required to boost consumption.
But while we're at taxes, Dr. Jalan, the GST is a done deal, and thank God for that. But do you believe the convergence in rates is going to begin with Budget 2017? And is it a fair assessment and as an assumption then to presume that service tax rates could be spiked because that will be a natural follow-on to the GST?
Absolutely. But GST is a very, very strong positive move again. It's a matter of introducing it, and it has been delayed by a couple of months, I think. But I am absolutely sure that once you have these uniform rates across our country, this would have a very positive effect, not only on transfer of goods from state to state, and but also in terms of mobility of capital also. So, what I am saying essentially is that this is a very positive step, and I hope that we will see it in the next budget, the date of introduction of GST. But just one point is that it will take some time to actually work on the ground, because ultimately all the states have to also pass legislation for GST, and all the rates have to conform. So what the impact will be, and then there are transfer of resources from the center to the states. So the ingredients and the mechanics of it is, we should be patient and see how it works out. But I have no doubt that this is one of the very major positive policy moves.
So while we're at taxes, and before I switch gears, Jahangir Aziz, the Prime Minister did make a case for taxing markets, and then of course LTCG reintroduction rattled the indices, and Finance Minister came in and did some amount of clarification. Is there a case for taxing Indian markets right now?
My guess is that, some of these statements were meant for in a different context than in the terms of, actually taxing, let's say, long-term capital gains. Taxing long-term capital gains will not only have a negative impact on the market, but it will also change the behavior not just of individual investors, but also of institutional investors. Now, seeking revenue or increasing the efficiency of the tax system is obviously something that every government strives for. But at the same time, one needs to look into whether or not the lack, let's say, of long-term capital gains tax is that a binding constraint either to the development of the market or the development of capital markets, or is that a binding constraint to India's, to better tax revenue for India? I would argue that that may be something that the government could look into, but that cannot be the number one issue. The number one issue still remains that we need to implement a much more simplified GST, because the bang for your buck is significantly more there without the negative consequences if we do a clean, efficient GST. We need to expand the base of our direct tax collection. We need to get back many other sectors into direct taxes, remove the loopholes again. And the reason why you want to do that is because small changes there can potentially lead to very large changes in revenue, again, without the attendant negative consequences of trying to, let's say, tax long-term capital gains. These are things that, at the end of the day, if you tax if the tax rate on long-term capital gains is very large, it obviously is going to have a very large negative impact and change behavior. If it is a very small number that you're going to put in, that's an irritation. And it's much better to focus on the big things rather than irritate investors, foreign investors, domestic investors. So my view is that focus on GST, focus on direct taxes rather than move to things like banking transaction tax or taxes on cash withdrawals above a certain limit and things like that. These are irritating things. They raise the transaction costs, and they usually complicates the process of investing in an economy, and you don't want to really do that.
All right, I buy your point there, but it's time to switch the focus on fiscal consolidation, and that's a discussion before every budget, is it not? Because there is an argument there which says that India should be fixated with the fisc, and there's one more which says, can we afford to postpone fiscal consolidation by a few years? But that perhaps could be read as a sign of weakness and credibility. What's your view on that, Jahangir?
Right. So again, Surpiya, let me answer that question by providing you with, what is the context in which the government decides to, let's say, postpone fiscal consolidation, let's say, for 2-3 years. If the context in which the government is postponing fiscal consolidation is that, look, we are going to implement a GST, which will change the nature of and the structure of indirect taxes in India. And for that, we need the extra space simply because we do not know whether or not in the initial phase of the implementation of GST, revenues can fall. There is a fear that it might fall. In order to give comfort to the states from that fear, we need to have that extra space. If the context in which I am or the government is expanding, or not just expanding but postponing fiscal consolidation, is that they are going to restructure spending, as I said, moving towards more healthcare and more spending from the central government standpoint on education. All of them have large long-term benefits. I think that the market will take that as take that much more benignly than if the markets if one goes and says, look, we are really facing a temporary shock for 2-3 quarters, but we want to support the economy for those 2-3 quarters, even though it is usually doesn't really work that way, and I'm going to abandon fiscal consolidation. Then the market reacts to it and says, really, you're going to add more demand, let's say in the second half of 2017-18, when consumption demand is actually going to recover. That will be bad for inflation, bad for borrowing, etc., and the market will react negatively. So again, it depends upon, I wouldn't say it depends on the affordability, more than the context in which you're saying I'm going to abandon or I'm going to delay the path of fiscal consolidation.
So it's really the context of fiscal deficit which will be a decisive factor for Jahangir Aziz. But Dr. Jalan, what do you think? You've been both at North Block and at Mint Street. Fiscal deficit, can we afford to delay consolidation in the search of growth through our weight behind fiscal spending, perhaps?
I have no doubt that the priority should be in increasing expenditure. Now, what expenditure? Essentially, I believe that the most important thing is to introduce, or to rather increase capital expenditure, investment expenditure, which would provide growth as jobs, and as well as encourage the private sector also to come forth with related industry and so on and so forth. So, I think that is the major priority. Fortunately, we have the fiscal space to get it done, and I am sure that the government will take advantage of it just now.
So just very quickly, because we are referring to fiscal deficit, and I want to refer to the FRBM panel as well, and it talks about the government's debt. The RBI governor himself has warned about rising debt levels or rising borrowing and the need to spend. Will the government have to watch its balance sheet perhaps far more closely, Dr. Jalan, this time around?
No, naturally, everybody has to, every country has to watch the balance sheet, and you are right in a way that our debt part is high as a percentage of GDP, and the interest payments are high, and so on and so forth. But that does not in any way undermine the importance of the fiscal space that we now have. If you meet our targets in the FRBM terms, which are 3.5%, then 3%, or whether it is 3.7% or 3.2%, 3.3%, I mean, it does not matter from the second digit part. From the country's point of view, what we need is to get it done, which is capital expenditure, investment, and a much more direct benefit to the people. So, I am absolutely sure that you would see a very good move on that score just now. And the new FRBM report, I have not seen it myself, but it has also taken a very positive stand. So, all told, I think we are in good shape. I am sorry to keep on repeating this point.
No, we like to hearing the point about being in good shape, because not very often do you hear that point. But Jahangir Aziz, just quick closing comments then. The RBI's credibility amidst this entire demonetisation exercise has taken a little bit of hit, and people within the RBI feel that the autonomy has been dented. I have two questions there, the one on credibility and one on what does this budget mean for the RBI's monetary policy stance? They stayed put, perhaps waiting for the next budget to throw some light on the fiscal position.
So again, I'm going to answer the question in two parts, right? And the first part is that let's look at India's monetary policy with or without getting into the question of RBI independence or the lack thereof, right? As far as I can remember, India's monetary policy has always been driven by fiscal dominance. Fiscal policy has always dominated India's monetary policy. When fiscal policy has gone on a consolidation mode, space has been created for monetary policy to act independently. When fiscal policy has not been on a consolidation mode, i.e. it hasn't created the space, then the space for monetary policy independence has been restricted, and this is regardless of whether it's the current administration or the previous administration or any other administration in the RBI. And just to give you a sense, just look at the open market operations that has been done in the last 2-3 years. In the guise that India needs to or the central bank needs to provide liquidity because foreign inflows have been less than what was desired, but the amount of open market operations that has been done is a significant portion of the government's and both the state and the central government's combined fiscal deficit. So there has been a significant of accommodation that the RBI has done. Again, I'm not going to say that the RBI has done that to accommodate the budget. It has done for monetary policy and liquidity provision reason, but the implication of all of this has been there has been significant amount of accommodation provided by the RBI.
So, Dr. Jalan, just as someone who's been there at the RBI and knows exactly how it works, do you buy the point that fiscal policy always determines what monetary policy will be? And how crucial do you think Budget 2017 will be for the bosses at RBI to decide on their monetary policy stance?
No, this budget is very important, for all segments of the economy, including the RBI. And I have no doubt that so far as RBI is concerned, the most important task that we now have is the autonomy of the RBI. And in the current situation, it is absolutely within control, and within there's something which is good for the economy is a move on the interest rates in line with the inflationary environment, which is very positive. So I am looking forward to, I mean, but whether they do it or not do it, I mean, it's a question of trade-off between growth, between inflation, between, what is the timing of it and how the whole thing works out in terms of agricultural output and demand for funds and so on. So let us see what comes out.
All right, there's a lot to see and there's a lot to analyze. But thanks very much, Dr. Bimal Jalan and Jahangir Aziz, for joining us right here on ET Now and discussing state of the economy as India steps into perhaps one of its most transformational budgets of all time. Thanks very much, viewers, for tuning in.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.